Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Roslyn Layton, founder of China Tech Threat. Today's topic is competing views of the future of BIS. This is a very exciting topic, and I'm pleased that we have two of America's leading experts to explore this important discussion about the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. And just last week, BIS has confirmed, after some 5 years of not having confirmed leadership, the Senate confirmed Alan Estevez to the role of Undersecretary. So to look at the future for this new Undersecretary and related issues on export control and strategic leadership and treaties, we have with us today Kevin Wolf, who is with Akin Gump, has been with BIS for 7 years, and much of that time he was in the number 2 role. And we also have Derek Scissors, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a leading economist on the economics of China, and he also serves as a commissioner at the U.S.-China Security and Review Commission. So, gentlemen, welcome. Great to have you today. So let's kick it off here. We have a new BIS secretary coming in the next few days. Let's talk about what should be his priorities in the next 90 days. Kevin, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Happy to help. Each of these could be a lengthy discussion, but the main first step will be, or should be, for Alan to have a very clear vision of export control policy and his enforcement priorities to discuss internally with BIS staff, with Commerce Management, the other agencies that are necessary for export controls, and the NSC, and then work to smooth out any rough edges on how they do or don't align with broader administration objectives. But he needs to take the lead on that because export control policy, as this call indicates, is really at an inflection point. In its current version, post-Cold War version, it was created to regulate weapons of mass destruction, conventional military items, and the bespoke and dual-use commodity software and technology necessary for their development, production, or use. And now the national security objectives uniformly are far broader than that, but there's not a lot of definition around exactly what those are or should be or how to make them effective through the use of the allies. And so, he's really going to need to take the lead on developing this vision and making it effective. The short-term immediate effort, and then I'll stop, obviously, is with respect to the Russia sanctions, export controls, and most importantly, the enforcement. And that'll dominate most of his time, of course, because that's the biggest, most pressing matter. And BIS has just done an amazingly effective job at pulling together and working with the allies in very novel, creative ways to have very effective sanctions, and enforcing those will be a key priority for Alan. I don't really see it as a detraction from the point that I just made. Actually, as I'll describe in some of the answers to your later questions, really an accelerant for multilateral action with non-traditional export control objectives. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you all and ask more questions.
Great. Well, and what about you, Derek? What is your advice for Alan Estevez in the next 90 days?
Well, I think, first of all, it's good that we finally have a confirmed BIS undersecretary. It's been a long time. We had an acting, but we have not had a confirmed undersecretary for years and years. I don't think I can give a top 3 short-term priorities because, as Kevin mentioned, it's really about Russia in the short term, and I'm not a Russia expert. So I will give what I would say should be his top 3 long-term priorities. I don't think they will be his top 3 long-term priorities, but hope springs eternal. I would like to rebalance economics and national security. BIS in practice, in my view, goes beyond the economic component of national security to beyond including it to prioritizing it. It's not an export promotion agency. It's not a business promotion agency. BIS's working definition of national security, in my opinion, is tilted wrongly and badly towards economics. Related to that, I would like to move from seeking multilateral cooperation from seemingly to requiring it. It's certainly better to have multilateral cooperation, but it takes time. It's not always possible. And importantly, it requires U.S. leadership. BIS frequently acts like the most important factor is whether other companies will take business from the U.S. if the U.S. imposes export controls. That is a factor, but it should not be the prevailing factor. And finally, and something we'll get on later, so I'll be really brief. I want to see some export controls implemented on foundational technology. It was overwhelmingly passed by the Congress in summer of 2018. We are coming up on 4 years now. BIS has been infuriating in its treatment of this issue. I don't know any other way to put it. That's, he's not going to do exactly what I want. That's not what I'm expecting. He may have better actions, better informed actions to take, but doing nothing has become unacceptable. And we'll talk a bit more about that later.
Great. So I want to point out a couple of things for our audience today. If you want to learn, dig deeper into some of these things, you can go to China Tech Threat. We have a website called the Future of BIS. We have a series of recommendation papers about this agency, which try to tease out some of these points where we have looked at what Derek's described there about the foundational emerging technologies. We've also covered an important point that Kevin has made about what's the working definition of national security. We link to these valuable testimonies that have been made. And of course, you can go to AEI, where Derek's papers are all made and easily visible, many valuable notes. And I'm sure very soon you can go to Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and it will include some interesting points by Kevin. So in any case, so one of the things that I think we have a diverse audience today, they might wonder, bandy about this term of export controls, and it might mean different things to different people. My own definition is a set of norms and rules we evolved because in a world of free trade, people will also trade in weapons. But I think, as Derek has rightly pointed out, there's this attempt to draw balance between economics and security, which doesn't necessarily work in practice. So let's take an example that's in the news. Also last week, it was reported that Apple is going to source chips from the Chinese military fab YMTC, Yangtze Memory Technologies, for the iPhone. And Apple itself was stating that it needs to go to YMTC because its other supplier, Kioxia in Japan, had a contamination event, so they couldn't get the supply they needed. And then Foxconn had suspended operations in Shenzhen because of COVID. But Apple has been talking with YMTC for of years. Anyway, Derek, you are one of the leading proponents of what we might call technology decoupling or partial decoupling. I'm wondering if this sort of event with a leading American company working with the Chinese military fab, is this a kind of fallout of us not having a decoupling strategy? And maybe that, YMTC would have already been designated a military end user, but not having leadership at BIS, this fell through the cracks. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Yangtze Memory, the issue with Yangtze Memory and Apple is not an export control issue. It's a supply chain issue. So it certainly fits under decoupling. It doesn't really fit under export controls and BIS. In my view, Apple should not sell products in the U.S. using Chinese chips. I say that to policymakers because I want the U.S. to avoid dependence on China-made chips. We have more than enough Chinese products as it is here that we have to deal with. I'd say the same thing to Apple because if they start an arrangement with the Yangtze Memory, they may find it be abruptly cut off by events out of their control. The military end user list, the military investment list, there are a long list of companies that could be added. And I'm not sure Yangtze Memory is actually near the top of that list. I don't know. When I say I'm not sure, I don't mean that in I really am sure. I mean it in I'm actually not sure. But I do know that there are supply chain discussions in front of Congress that are sector-based that would include this discussion that involve not relying on Chinese products being shipped to the U.S. If Apple is buying chips to sell only products in China, that's a pretty high bar for U.S. action to get involved with. We'd have to have information, I think, that Yangtze Memory is such an important PLA partner that we don't want to assist the firm. But the important thing here is there's a supply chain issue about supplying products to the U.S. that Apple, for a number of reasons, in my view, should not be adding a mainland Chinese partner. If it's about supplying chips in China, then the bar for Yangtze Memory being a bad actor is quite high, and I don't think we've met that bar yet.
Right. So I wonder, this is one of the things that the chips would only go to, maybe iPhone 14 SE in China, but is there a concern that once they develop the relationship, these chips could seep out. I mean, they can end up in the U.S. supply, for example. Is that a concern from your perspective?
Well, I mean, that's the slippery slope argument. I mean, the solution here is proper U.S. regulation, and just say either Yangtze Memory really is a bad actor. Again, I don't think the evidence is sufficient to do that yet, in which case we should interfere and they should be labeled as a bad actor. There are U.S. sanctions that would block transactions with Yangtze Memory. Again, I don't think those sanctions are currently justified, but I could be wrong. And then the second part is, it's not Yangtze Memory. It's we don't want Chinese chips in U.S. products. We don't want Chinese chemicals in U.S. pharmaceuticals, in my opinion. There are a lot of supply chain restrictions that I think we should be moving forward on. The Biden administration keeps studying it. The one action they've taken is about batteries, which is not where I would have started. Congress has bills in front of it, going to conference soon on bills with a bunch of supply chain provisions. That's the broader solution. What I'm trying to get at here is, unless Yangtze Memory is a really bad actor, they're not the issue here. The issue here is Chinese products coming to the U.S. in critical sectors, which the Congress has said it wants to investigate and perhaps limit, but it hasn't done it yet.
Got it. Okay. Well, I want to just get one more, just so people can understand your view. I'm just going to ask one more question for clarification, and then we're going to go to Kevin. But as I understand, your discussion about decoupling is not about not engaging. It's not an issue that we would stop trade with China. It's really about that semiconductors itself are so important and so complex that the day-to-day issues of trying to manage this from a BIS level or any other is just not practical. And then the main reason for doing the decoupling is really for U.S. workers and U.S. jobs. Can you sort of summarize your view on technology decoupling for our audience?
All right. Well, Kevin, you can sign off now because I'm taking the rest of the time, and then I'm going to continue after everybody else is gone. This is a big question. Look, in my view, to start really at the top, there is no good outcome for the U.S.-China relationship while Xi Jinping or someone like him is in charge of China. The deterioration has been slow, but it's been clear. It should have been faster. We should have responded more quickly to Xi Jinping's depredations and Chinese economic aggression. But there is going to be decoupling, whether we like it or not. And it could come very quickly and suddenly, or it could become slowly and under our control. And I would rather the latter. I'd rather us think about this and say, where do we care about Chinese involvement in our economy, and where do we not care? There are a lot of elements of this. Export controls, certainly. Supply chains, as mentioned, outbound investment, and so on. So, the idea of decoupling is we don't want to be linked to this country to the extent that we are. It's not a fun government we're dealing with. It's a cult of personality dictatorship which set up labor camps, right? That's who we're talking about. That threatens its neighbors. Does that mean we should, embargo all Chinese products? Certainly not. So what's the middle solution? The middle solution is we start preparing for where we're uncomfortable depending on the Chinese. A classic example I mentioned earlier is pharmaceutical products, where Chinese fine chemicals dominate global production. Those are the inputs into pharmaceuticals. On the technology side, since we're supposedly in a competition with China, we probably should not be helping them advance technologically. Before we get to sanctions, of punishing some Chinese firm, the easy thing to do is don't provide them with technology. That's what CFIUS reform was supposed to do, and I think has done. It's what export control is supposed to do, and I'm not sure it has done. And then we have another problem of outbound investment going to Chinese tech firms. So, on the technology side, we have inbound investment, we have export controls, we have outbound investment. Those are not sanctions. They're preventing the U.S. from helping China when we're supposed to be in a competition with what I think is a dangerous government. And we have not done that properly yet. So we're not talking about trying to destroy China or punishing Chinese firms. We're trying to make sure we don't help the Chinese in technology, which we are continuing to do.
All right. So, Kevin, I'm going to switch gears and go to you because I think you have, you've worked at BIS. You've had a lot of time to think about it. You've written a lot about it. And if I understand your view, what you're really talking about is that, if I'm correct, if I'm wrong here, we need to rethink what this is about, because there's perhaps a mistake in that we have a tool, which is BIS, which becomes the kind of the de facto security instrument when it wasn't designed to do that. I want to give you the opportunity to explain and lay out for us where you think we are, and as you said, an inflection point. So please, take the time you need to explain what that is about. What is this inflection point, and how do we need to rethink this?
Yeah, it's very consistent with my opening statement, and Derek raised a lot of the topics that are being floated for a new use for export controls. That is, the limitation on the movement of commodity software technology and occasionally services to accomplish an objective. One of which is the supply chain resiliency point. And this isn't something other than from the 1970s dealing with Western red cedar and actually horses that, supply chain issues, the export controls are really designed to address. And going back to the point of economics and just losing money, remember, it has to not just be a control, but a control that's also effective. And that's where the multilateralism comes in, or the word that I've been trying to get into the ecosystem in this context is plurilateralism, meaning coordinated action by close allies of the producer nations, of the technologies of concern, outside the traditional proliferation concerns to achieve novel objectives. And history has shown that when the U.S. goes it alone, although effective in the short run, eventually is ineffective, meaning that not just that U.S. companies lose money, but the same items, whatever they are sold by our allies to China or the other country of concern. And so you always come back to the need for plurilateralism or multilateralism as a long-term objective. And the only way in which you're going to get there in a non-traditional way, outside the regime process, outside the proliferation focus, which has been the cornerstone of export control since the end of Cold War, the end of the Cold War, is by having a clear vision as to the new role. ECRA gives us that authority, but most importantly, convincing the allies that this is a common shared threat, that they need to change their laws and rules in order to implement, so that we are working the same path together. Otherwise, you have a feel-good export control on shipments from the U.S., but either the U.S. companies move overshore or their foreign competition simply fills in the gap at selling the same items because the exports are not illegal. And the supply chain resiliency point is one of the harder ones. I think Civ Mill fusion is a little bit more intellectually understandable by the allies in terms of a new control, as well as the technology leadership or responding to strategic economic objectives as a national security threat. And this is where, by the way, just a last point, there's a significant amount of policy thinking right now going on involving a really serious and legitimate point that Derek pointed out on outbound investment. There's a bill right now in the USA and the USICA bills. The Cornyn Casey bill is the original version, but it's identical. And there's lots of rumors and discussions about administrative action to regulate outbound investment, such as that which would be an indigenous development of a technology that couldn't be exported if made in the U.S., or that would be in support of human rights or Chinese military intelligence. Industrial complex applications. And it's a relatively novel concept that's never existed in the U.S. before, but it's a hot topic that could be maybe a better tool to address some of the issues than just mere limitations on movement of stuff and things. But again, the same point, in order for it to be effective, you'd have to have the allies to regulate the same things from their countries. Otherwise, the same investment by a U.S. company would occur by its UK or Bahama sub. Anyway, so that's a general answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. So, Derek, this is hardly the first time policymakers or anyone's observed, well, we need to rethink BIS, or what's the role? I mean, look at 2018, there was major legislative update. I mean, this happens in a regular period. We can look at many points through time where there has been an effort by Congress recognizing all the concerns we've laid out on the table, and a subsequent legislative update that says this is what we need to do, and it seems like it's spelled out. I mean, you have argued that Congress has been very clear about what BIS should do, publishing lists of foundational and emerging technologies. So what is your response to that? You seem to have chronicled the BIS's response to how, or perhaps lack thereof, based upon what Congress has said.
Yeah, I don't, I can create a list of emerging technology actions. The whole thing about there should be a list, to me avoids the major issue, right? There have been emerging technology actions taken on a multilateral basis by BIS since export control reform. And I can create a list, and there's the list. And so if you want a list, we have it. The problem is on foundational technologies, we don't have anything. And it's connected to, and this is probably where Kevin and I might disagree the most, although I'm not sure how much we disagree. It's connected to too much focus on multilateral cooperation. In emerging technologies, there may be technologies that are only supplied by the United States because they're emerging, they're brand new. With foundational technologies, they're definitely supplied by other countries. That's the whole point of saying like these technologies exist. So if you were to impose foundational technology export controls, you're at a much higher risk of loss to U.S. business. And shock, BIS never does that. And they have come up with different excuses over time in personal communication with me and in public that are disingenuous at best. There has to be, Congress didn't create the foundational technology category for BIS to decide, no, it isn't going to work. It isn't their job to do that. It's their job to implement the law, even if they don't like the law. Tough. So there's actually a sort of a semi-constitutional issue here with BIS and the executive branch. And this is under the Trump administration and the Biden administration. This is not a partisan remark. It has been going on now for 3.5 years. And in fact, I would say the Trump administration's record is clearly worse because the Biden administration did not have an undersecretary until recently. But it isn't up to BIS to say, oh, the time isn't right to do what Congress told us to do 3.5 years ago. There is an argument to be made that American leadership on this issue will bring in more cooperation. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that applies across the board. But even if you see losses to American firms or the potential for losses, there are foundational technologies that should be restricted. Semiconductor technology is right at the top of that list, and BIS has failed to. So the number one thing I'm going to look for from new Undersecretary Estevez is a plan. The plan isn't going to be exactly what I want, but something where he doesn't just say, yeah, we're working on that. That's a really tough issue, blah, 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 allies, blah, blah, blah. He does something. The clock has started. He wasn't on the clock before. BIS was, Commerce was, Secretary Raimondo was, Secretary Ross was before that. His personal clock has started. And if I were a committee chair, I would say, hey, we'd like to see you in September and see what's going on. And that doesn't mean everything has to be done at warp speed. And it certainly doesn't mean export control should substitute for supply chain action, outbound investment, the other things we're talking about. It means when Congress tells you to do something, you're supposed to do it. And if you don't do it, there should be consequences.
So, Kevin, what's your response to that? How do you see this? How do you see how BIS should respond? When we look at 2018, the export controls that were adopted and how BIS has suggested and responded.
So the audio was a little unclear, but I think it's how should BIS respond. And I was obviously a huge proponent of ECRA and FIRMA testifying in favor of both and the combination of the two and the connection of outbound and export controls. And if something was so sensitive as to warrant inbound consideration controls, it should be controlled on the outbound side. In retrospect, I think perhaps we were maybe a little bit too subtle. The core concept in ECRA was to not only regulate the traditional export control ideas, the non-proliferation focused ones, but it literally says, including in addition to those non-traditional export control issues, and the emerging and foundational provision says to regulate items that are essential to the national security of the United States, but aren't identified effectively in any of the other regimes for reasons that were not traditional. And in retrospect, in terms of guidance and clarity as to what was within the scope of foundational or emerging, these various topics that we keep rattling off: supply chain resiliency, human rights, civil military fusion, responding to economic dominance objectives, perhaps could have been a little bit more clear to give direction. The issue with the foundational, and Derek rightly pointed out, is it's a very challenging legal standard because it says to the extent a technology is already widely available, then it's not a good candidate for a foundational control. And that makes the universe of what meets that definition quite narrow. And also then the definition of national security is unclear. So in terms of what BIS should do, and we're going to get to this in your next question, I think it's with the new money that's coming in, it needs a lot of people who are experts in each of these non-traditional areas. I realize there are labs and think tanks and technical advisory committees and the Defense Department and energy and the intelligence community that all have expertise in any of these areas. But you could use, and my advocacy would that BIS use all of the new money for the new staff that it can hire who are subject matter experts in AI and quantum and robotics and nanotechnology and commercial semiconductor capability and how they're designed and built and produced. All things that don't have a relationship to chemical biological weapons or nuclear items or electronic warfare systems or military aircraft engines. And that will radically and dramatically advance the ability to not only get to the right answer, but ask the right questions to implement a new spirit and purpose of export controls properly.
So, again, our theme today is competing views of the future of BIS. So we have on one hand, this kind of is it a leadership opportunity to reinvigorate BIS, and if there's a $30 million budget addition given to BIS, Kevin has talked about getting the subject matter experts. It could be perhaps additional enforcement officers. I'm going to turn back to you for a moment, Derek, because I think you've been clear in your writings where you've said, look.
Rosalind, can you turn up your volume or get closer to the mic? You're kind of fading in and out. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excuse me. So, you have talked about in your writing that if BIS can't do what Congress says, then this function needs to be moved to another agency or another department. And you have suggested perhaps State Department. Do you think that the challenge you've expressed, can this be addressed by BIS leadership? Can BIS be reinvigorated, or is your view, would the function be better addressed in another place?
So, I mean, as we all said at the outset, and I think it's pretty obvious, the Undersecretary should have a chance to deal with these issues and decide, what's possible and what's not possible, and to speak to Congress about, what he thinks should be done and see how that fits with what Congress thinks should be done. Again, we have not had a confirmed Undersecretary running that agency for a long time. This is a problem. So that's point one. I think there are kind of two ways to look at this. There's the as I referred to before, the semi-constitutional way, which is, I doubt he would say this clearly, but if the Undersecretary said, I'm not going to do, or it turns out that BIS does not do what Congress wants, then Congress should remove authority. Congress is in charge here, not the implementing agency, which a fact which seems to have been lost for some aspects of the bill passed in summer of 2018. On the substantive side, and this is certainly, I'm absolutely not putting words in Kevin's mouth, because I don't think he's going to agree with this, but I think the evolving nature of the problem, which we have all touched on, and Kevin's very eloquent about it, suggests maybe BIS is not the right agency anymore, or the BIS that we have had for a long time that has been effective for most of that time, in my view, is not the right agency anymore. So either BIS has to change fairly significantly, or it needs to be moved to another authority. The world is very different than it was 15 years ago, and I'm not sure that BIS is different or is insufficiently different, at least, again, prior to having confirmed leadership. So, the alternatives are, there's no perfect alternative. If there was a perfect alternative, I would have been running around saying, this is the agency, this needs to be moved to. So there's going to be a cost if you move authority. Like I said, Congress should move authority, in my opinion, if they continue not to see an agency implement their wishes. But if you're going to move authority, you're going to lose something. You're going to lose the technical knowledge that BIS has, and you may gain something else. If export controls have a broadened definition of national security, that suggests the State Department might be a good place for it. USTR has the expertise, doesn't have the size and the resources. So you'd have to make an adjustment there. DOD has the size and the resources, but not the expertise. There are offices under the Office of Secretary of Defense that could handle this, but you'd have to expand them. The question, I agree with Kevin, even though we may disagree on the solution. The export control world is different, and we have to decide whether BIS, as previously constituted, is going to be satisfactory. Part of that's going to be determined by what Undersecretary Estevez says. If he satisfies the Congress, then we're in business here. We don't have to worry about the implementing agency defying the Congress, and the Congress, presumably the Congress would be satisfied that BIS can handle the new situation that we're in. I have doubts about that, and therefore I would like to consider the possibility that BIS is no longer the appropriate venue for what are our current U.S. policy goals, which are different than they were 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, just in the last minute, let me just respond quickly in defense of BIS. I think look at what they did with the Russia export controls, how clever and creative and effective, and I mean, really novel, hard work, it shows the power and effectiveness of multilateralism and creative thinking. And that could only have happened with a group of people that are at BIS now who are true subject matter experts, who really know how the levels work and really know how industry works, and were able to work with the allies to create something truly effective. So if any agency has proved its worth at being able to achieve the really novel challenges that I think Derek and I both agree that exist, it's the staff and people at BIS, and Alan can really take and lead that effort. And you're going to have the same issues at any other agency, or worse, that's different. But you already have the infrastructure and the industry facing and the capability there. I'm just saying, use the new money that's coming in for additional subject matter areas in these non-traditional topics, and it's going to be far better than any other part of the U.S. government to accomplish. It was a difficult assignment, and no one's denying it. The last point I would mention, just while I have the platform, is in order to advance these objectives, the opportunity of the Russia sanctions and export controls that I just mentioned, I think now is the opportunity to create a fifth export control regime. And BIS with state should lead that exercise. And what I mean by that is, there are the four regimes that structure export controls: missiles, chem-bio, nuclear, conventional military. And Russia is a member of three of them, and in fact, the chair of the missile technology control regime this year. So those regimes are going to become less effective, I predict, as a result of Russia involvement. But they also don't have as their legal mandate, as their scope, the ability to address any of these non-traditional issues we've been talking about on the call. And so the connections have been made. The work that BIS has led, along with state and treasury, to create this effective de facto alliance of the willing, the 33 plus countries that are working against Russia, take all that good work and advance it to achieve both things that can't be addressed by the other multilateral regimes, plus multilateral coordination and all these other new topics that we've listed on this call. I've got a longer commentary on that, but I think this is really an opportunity, and the response to Russia has done in a month what would have taken, I think, years and years of outreach to the allies to accomplish.
So, well, this has been a very exciting lunchtime conversation. Clearly, there's a lot more to dig into. This is all the time we have for today, but I want to thank Kevin Wolf of Akin Gump, also a new visiting fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown. We'll be looking forward to your new work. And of course, many thanks to Derek Scissors, American Enterprise Institute, and the U.S.-China Economic Security and Review Commission. Thank you both. There will be a new BIS Undersecretary, and this has been an exciting discussion. And please check us out at ChinaTechThreat.com. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also check out Future of BIS, where we will archive this discussion, and we will post, make links to the speakers today, and you can learn about more of their very exciting ideas there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.